On October 17, 1777, a British army that had entered New York with the confidence of empire laid down its weapons in a field near Saratoga. Its commander, Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, had begun the campaign believing he was marching toward a decisive blow against the American rebellion. Instead, he walked into one of the most consequential reversals of the Revolutionary War. Nearly 6,000 men became prisoners, and within months the surrender convinced France that the United States was no longer merely surviving. It could win. At the start of 1777, that outcome would have seemed almost impossible. Britain still held New York City. The Royal Navy controlled the Atlantic coastline. Washington's army had endured winter, desertion, shortages, and a string of defeats that made the rebellion look fragile from the outside. In London, many officials believed the colonies were exhausted. The war, they thought, needed only one clean strategic stroke to break apart what remained of American resistance. That belief was dangerous because it confused military strength with political control. Britain could seize ports, scatter militia, and win formal battles, but the rebellion was not only an army. It was a network of local committees, county militias, supply routes, printers, merchants, and stubborn communities that could lose ground without surrendering the cause. The British High Command understood the map of North America better than it understood the social machinery that kept the revolt alive. The plan chosen for that stroke was built around the Hudson River. If British forces could control the corridor from Canada to New York City, New England would be separated from the middle and southern colonies. The region that had supplied so much of the rebellion's political energy would be isolated, and the Continental cause would be forced to fight without coordination, supplies, or momentum. On a map, the logic was simple. In the wilderness of upstate New York, it would become something else entirely. The Hudson Corridor had strategic importance because it offered one of the few practical routes through the northern interior. Rivers and lakes could carry men, artillery, and supplies farther than roads could. For imperial planners in London, that made the line from Canada to Albany appear like a natural blade pointed at the center of the rebellion. What the plan underestimated was how easily that blade could be slowed once it entered broken country controlled by people who knew every road, creek, and pass. 3 British columns were supposed to make the plan work. Burgoyne would march south from Canada along Lake Champlain and toward Albany. General William Howe, commanding the main British army in New York, was expected to move north up the Hudson. A third force under Barry St. Ledger would push east through the Mohawk Valley. If the columns joined, the colonies would be split in two. If one of them failed, the entire design would begin to unravel. The officer who fought hardest for command of the northern column was Burgoyne himself. He was a veteran of the 7 Years' War, a member of Parliament, and a man with the confidence and polish of the British elite. His soldiers called him Gentleman Johnny, a nickname that captured both his charm and his taste for comfort. He carried with him not only an army, but the habits of a man who expected the campaign to end in glory. That expectation shaped many of the choices that followed. Burgoyne was not a fool. He understood European war, wrote persuasively, and could explain a campaign with clarity that impressed ministers and monarchs. His weakness was more subtle. He believed that a well-designed plan, once approved by power, would impose itself on events. He did not fully grasp how quickly a wilderness campaign could punish pride, delay communication, and turn every assumption into a liability. Saratoga would become a lesson in the difference between a strategy that looks elegant and a strategy that survives contact with reality. In June, Burgoyne assembled his invasion force at St. John's in Quebec. It included British regulars, German troops hired by the Crown, Loyalist volunteers, French-Canadian militia, and Native American allies from frontier nations. It also included a heavy artillery train and a baggage column loaded with equipment, provisions, tents, and personal comforts. The army looked formidable. It was disciplined, well-armed, and dangerous. Yet it was also heavy, slow, and dependent on a supply line that would stretch farther with every mile south. The artillery in particular revealed the contradiction at the heart of the expedition. More than a symbol of power, cannon could dominate forts and formal defensive positions. But every gun also required horses, crews, ammunition, spare parts, and roads strong enough to carry it. In open European country, that burden could be managed. In the northern forests, it became a chain tied to the army's ankle. Burgoyne was bringing the tools of siege warfare into terrain that punished weight above almost everything else. At first, the campaign seemed to justify Burgoyne's confidence. On July 6th, his forces captured Fort Ticonderoga, the American stronghold on Lake Champlain, after British artillery was placed on nearby high ground. The American garrison abandoned the fort during the night, leaving behind guns, stores, and a psychological disaster. In Britain, the news was celebrated as proof that the invasion was working. In the colonies, it shook confidence in a fortress many had believed could stop any army from Canada. For Burgoyne, Ticonderoga created a dangerous illusion. The campaign appeared to be moving faster than American resistance could organize. But the real obstacle was not the fort he had taken. It was the land beyond it. Instead of taking the faster water route down Lake George, he chose to push overland through dense forest between Skinnysboro and Fort Edward. The distance was not great on a map, but every mile had to be fought against terrain, weather, and an enemy that understood how to turn delay into a weapon. General Philip Schuyler, then commanding American forces in the north, knew he could not defeat Burgoyne in a conventional battle. So he attacked the campaign itself. American work parties destroyed bridges, blocked roads with felled trees, flooded low ground, burned supplies, and stripped the countryside of food and forage. The British advance slowed to a crawl. Men cut through forest, rebuilt roads, dragged cannon through mud, and watched their supply line lengthen behind them. The wilderness did not stop Burgoyne in one dramatic blow. It exhausted him a little more each day. This was not glamorous warfare, but it was strategically ruthless. A bridge destroyed at the right moment could cost more time than a skirmish. A road blocked by trees could immobilize cannon. A field stripped of grain could force foragers farther from the column, where militia could ambush them. Schuyler's campaign of obstruction transformed distance into a weapon. Burgoyne could still move south, but he could no longer move south on the timetable that made the British plan work. The deeper the British army moved, the more hostile the countryside became. Militia appeared along the edges of the march, striking foragers and supply wagons before vanishing into familiar woods. Every delay gave more Americans time to gather. Every rumor of British weakness encouraged another local company to take the field. Burgoyne had expected speed to keep the rebellion off balance. Instead, his slow progress gave the rebellion time to surround him with pressure. Then came the killing of Jane McCrae, a young loyalist woman whose death at the hands of native warriors allied with the British became a powerful piece of American propaganda. The facts of the incident were contested even then, but its effect was not. Across the frontier, the story spread with fury. Men who had hesitated to join the militia now saw Burgoyne's army not as a distant imperial force, but as an immediate threat to their homes and families. The British alliance meant to intimidate the backcountry helped mobilize it. For Burgoyne, the incident created a problem he could not easily repair. He needed native allies for scouting, raiding, and frontier pressure, but he also needed to convince civilians that British rule would restore order. The McCrae story destroyed that message in the minds of many colonists. Whether embellished or not, it gave the patriot cause a human face, a name, and a grievance that recruiters could repeat from town to town. The campaign was now losing not only supplies, but legitimacy. By August, Burgoyne's army needed supplies badly. Horses were failing, draft animals were scarce, and provisions were running short. He sent a detachment toward Bennington to seize horses, cattle, wagons, and stores. The force was led by Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum and included many German troops and loyalists. British intelligence suggested that the area might be friendly or weakly defended. It was neither. Near Bennington, Baum encountered Brigadier General John Stark and a large force of New Hampshire and Vermont militia. Stark knew frontier warfare and understood the kind of men he was leading. On August 16th, the Americans attacked from several directions, overwhelming Baum's position. When a German relief column arrived later in the day, it too was struck and defeated after reinforcements joined Stark. Burgoyne lost close to 1,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, and gained none of the supplies he needed. Bennington mattered because the Americans fought there with the confidence of men defending their own region. They were not protecting an abstract line on a strategic map. They were defending farms, roads, animals, and stores that made survival possible. The British detachment expected a supply. It found a local uprising organized around the terrain. By the end of the day, the blow to Burgoyne's army was material, psychological, and political all at once. Bennington did more than reduce Burgoyne's numbers. It damaged the confidence of the campaign. A raid meant to restore mobility had instead exposed the army's vulnerability. The loss removed experienced troops, failed to solve the supply crisis, and strengthened the belief that Burgoyne could be beaten. Far from clearing the road to Albany, the defeat made the road feel narrower. At the same time, the Western Column under Street Ledger failed in the Mohawk Valley. His force was checked at Fort Stanwix, and Benedict Arnold helped spread exaggerated reports of a large American relief force approaching. Native allies and loyalists began to lose confidence, and St. Ledger retreated toward Canada. One arm of the British plan had now disappeared. The second arm was no better. Howe, who was supposed to move north from New York City, had chosen instead to sail south and capture Philadelphia. The decision had its own logic. Philadelphia was the seat of Congress and a symbolic prize. But taking it did not destroy the rebellion, and it left Burgoyne isolated. The grand convergence on Albany was no longer a convergence at all. It was one army, deep in hostile country, still moving forward because its commander would not turn back. The failure of coordination exposed the weakness of British command across distance. Orders crossed the Atlantic slowly. Ministers wrote with ambiguity. Generals interpreted instructions according to their own priorities, rivalries, and ambitions. Howe wanted Philadelphia. Burgoyne wanted Albany. Germain approved pieces of both plans without ensuring that they could support one another. The result was not a single imperial strategy, but separate movements that only looked unified from far away. In September, Burgoyne crossed the Hudson River near Saratoga. It was a fateful move. Once across, retreat became harder, supplies became more fragile, and the American army stood between him and Albany. South of his position, American forces occupied Bemis Heights, a strong defensive line overlooking the Hudson Corridor. The terrain had been shaped for defense by Thaddeus Kosciuszko, a Polish engineer whose work helped make the position one of the strongest the Americans held during the war. The American army had changed since the shock of Ticonderoga. Horatio Gates had replaced Schuyler and now commanded a force swollen by militia from New England and New York. Farmers, craftsmen, riflemen, and Continental troops gathered around Bemis Heights because the campaign had begun to look winnable. Burgoyne, once the advancing power, now faced an enemy growing larger while his own army grew weaker. Gates brought caution, organization, and political skill. Arnold brought aggression. Morgan brought riflemen who could make the woods dangerous for officers and artillery crews. Kosciuszko gave the Americans ground that strengthened every part of their defense. None of these pieces alone guaranteed victory. Together, they created a system Burgoyne could not easily break: strong terrain, growing numbers, mobile light troops, and commanders who, however divided, understood that time now favored them. The first major clash came on September 19th at Freeman's farm. Burgoyne sent columns through the woods, hoping to test the American position and find a way forward. What he met was stubborn resistance led in part by Daniel Morgan's riflemen and Henry Dearborn's light infantry, supported by Benedict Arnold's aggressive pressure on Gates to fight forward rather than wait behind the defenses. The result was hours of brutal combat in broken woodland and open fields. The fighting at Freeman's farm had the character of a battle that neither side could fully control. Trees broke formations. Smoke made distance uncertain. Units stumbled into one another, rallied, fired, charged, and fell back. British discipline allowed Burgoyne's men to hold together under terrible pressure, but American resistance prevented that discipline from producing a breakthrough. The field was not simply won or lost. It was paid for, yard by yard, until the cost outweighed the value of holding it. Morgan's riflemen used their long rifles to target officers and artillery crews at distances that unnerved British troops accustomed to different battlefield rhythms. British regulars charged and drove the Americans back. American reinforcements surged forward and regained the ground. The field changed hands again and again. By nightfall, the British technically held the position, but the cost was severe. Hundreds of men were dead or wounded, and many officers had fallen. It was a tactical gain that deepened the strategic trap. After Freeman's farm, Burgoyne waited. He hoped for help from the south, for supplies, for some opening that would let him continue toward Albany. None came. American numbers increased around him. His own troops went on reduced rations. Horses starved. Loyalist and Canadian support weakened. Native allies, seeing the direction of the campaign, began to leave. The British Army remained disciplined, but discipline could not create food, reinforcements, or a road out. Those 18 days were a slow tightening of the campaign's central problem. Burgoyne could not advance without risking destruction, but he could not remain where he was indefinitely. Every day made the Americans stronger and the British weaker. The army that had marched south with cannon, baggage, and confidence now found itself measuring survival in rations, ammunition, horses, and rumors. Strategic initiative had passed quietly from the invader to the defenders. On October 7th, Burgoyne made one last attempt to break the deadlock. He sent a reconnaissance in force toward the American left, looking for a weak point. The movement was quickly detected. Gates ordered an attack, and the Americans struck with overwhelming energy. Morgan's riflemen hit the British right. Enoch Poor's brigade attacked the left. The British center came under pressure, and the line began to bend under fire from several directions. Then Benedict Arnold entered the battle. Gates had relieved him of command after a bitter dispute, but Arnold rode onto the field anyway, driven by fury, ambition, and a fearless instinct for the decisive moment. Whatever his later betrayal would make of his name, at Saratoga, he was one of the most forceful battlefield leaders in the American army. He rallied men, pushed attacks forward, and helped turn the American assault into a storm that the British position could not absorb. Arnold's presence remains one of the most uncomfortable truths of Saratoga. The man later remembered as a traitor was, on that day, a battlefield leader of extraordinary energy. His courage did not excuse what he would become, but his later betrayal cannot erase what he did before it. Saratoga holds both realities at once: heroism and resentment, sacrifice and ambition, a wounded officer whose greatest public service came before his most infamous act. The decisive point was the Bremen Redoubt, a German-held fortification anchoring the British right. Arnold led the attack toward it as the American line surged forward. The defenders were overwhelmed, and Arnold's horse was shot beneath him. The fall shattered his already wounded leg, the same leg injured during the failed assault on Quebec 2 years earlier. The redoubt fell, and with it the last stable anchor of Burgoyne's position. The loss of Brigadier General Simon Fraser compounded the collapse. Fraser had been one of Burgoyne's most capable commanders, riding along the line to steady troops under pressure. According to later accounts, Morgan directed a skilled rifleman to target him. Fraser was mortally wounded, and his fall carried a weight beyond one casualty. In an army already under strain, the loss of a commander who held men together by personal presence helped break what remained of British cohesion. That night, rain fell as Burgoyne ordered a retreat toward Saratoga. The army moved through darkness and mud, carrying wounded men where it could and abandoning what it could not save. American forces followed and closed around the retreating column. Roads to the north were cut. Artillery and sharpshooters made the British camp increasingly dangerous. Within days, Burgoyne's army was trapped near the Hudson with dwindling food, little ammunition to spare, and no realistic path of escape. Burgoyne opened negotiations. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered to Gates. The terms allowed officers to retain their swords and the troops to march out with the honors of war before stacking their weapons. Nearly 6,000 soldiers laid down their arms. The campaign that had been designed to split the colonies had ended with a British field army captured in the interior of New York. The ceremony mattered because war is fought not only with bullets and roads, but with symbols. Burgoyne's army had come south to demonstrate imperial inevitability. Its surrender demonstrated the opposite. The sight of British and German troops becoming prisoners told Americans that resistance could produce results, and told foreign governments that the rebellion was no longer a romantic gamble. It was a military fact. The surrender changed the meaning of the American war abroad. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin had been working to convince the French court that the United States was a cause worth supporting openly. France had already provided covert aid, but open alliance required proof that the Americans could survive against Britain. Saratoga supplied that proof. It showed that the Continental cause could defeat and capture a major British army, not merely evade destruction. France did not join the war out of sentiment alone. It saw a strategic opportunity to weaken Britain, avenge earlier defeats, and restore influence after the losses of the 7 Years' War. Saratoga made that opportunity appear realistic. Before the surrender, supporting the Americans openly risked backing a rebellion that might collapse. After the surrender, alliance became a calculated gamble with evidence behind it. On February 6, 1778, France signed treaties of commerce and alliance with the United States. French money, arms, officers, soldiers, and naval power transformed the war. Britain now faced not only a colonial rebellion, but a wider conflict against a European rival with global reach. Spain and the Netherlands would also enter the struggle, expanding the war across oceans and forcing Britain to defend an empire rather than suppress a single rebellion. The consequences eventually reached Yorktown. French naval power helped trap Cornwallis in Virginia. French troops fought alongside Washington's army. The surrender at Saratoga did not end the Revolutionary War, but it made the final American victory possible by changing who was willing to fight for it. A campaign meant to isolate New England had instead internationalized the revolution. That chain of consequences is what gives Saratoga its weight. Battles often matter because of the ground they seize or the armies they destroy. Saratoga mattered because it altered the diplomatic imagination of the war. It changed what seemed possible in Paris, what seemed necessary in London, and what seemed achievable in the American camp. The guns fell silent in New York, but the effects traveled across the Atlantic. For Burgoyne, the failure ended his military reputation. He returned to Britain on parole and spent years explaining the campaign's collapse. He blamed unclear orders, Howe's movement toward Philadelphia, the wilderness, logistics, and the difficulty of fighting across an ocean. Some of those explanations had merit, but none could erase the central fact. He had advanced beyond support, underestimated the American response, and lost an army. For Benedict Arnold, Saratoga became the cruelest turning point of his life. His heroism was real, and his wound was severe. Yet Gates received much of the public credit for the victory, while Arnold's grievances deepened. In time, resentment, debt, ambition, and anger helped carry him toward treason. The same man who had helped win one of the Revolution's decisive victories later tried to hand West Point to the British. At Saratoga, his courage is remembered by a monument shaped like a boot. It bears no name. The fields around Saratoga are quiet now, but the campaign remains one of the clearest examples of how strategy can fail when confidence outruns reality. Burgoyne had a plan that looked elegant from a distance. The Americans answered with delay, terrain, militia mobilization, defensive engineering, and commanders willing to strike when the moment came. The British came south to cut the rebellion apart. Instead, they proved to the world that the rebellion could endure. That is why Saratoga matters. It was not only a battlefield victory. It was the moment a local war became an international one, the moment British certainty began to fracture, and the moment the American cause gained the ally it needed to survive. Burgoyne thought he was marching toward the end of the revolution. He was marching toward the decision that made its success possible.